Part 3. Open in app. Listen via. The 1%, Gone Bad, Part 3. Corporate Sovereignty Zones. MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sunu MIX. April 11, 2026. Part 3, Technocratic Charter Strongholds. 11. Corporate Sovereignty Zones. The corporation was never supposed to govern. This is the foundational fiction that the corporate sovereignty zone exposes and discards. The corporation was supposed to produce, to organize capital and labor toward the efficient generation of goods and services, to operate within a legal framework it did not write, under a governance structure it did not control, subject to a regulatory authority that answered, however imperfectly, to a democratic public that was not the corporation's constituency but its context. The corporation was an instrument. A powerful instrument. An instrument that accumulated, over time, the resources, the legal personhood, the political influence, and the territorial presence of a significant sovereign entity. But an instrument nonetheless. Held, in theory, within a framework of public accountability. Subject, in theory, to the authority of the state that chartered it into existence and could, in theory, revoke that charter. The theory was always partially fictional. Corporations have shaped the states that nominally regulated them since the first joint stock company convinced a European monarch that his empire's expansion would be best served by delegating it to private capital. But the fiction was functional. It maintained the pretense that the corporation operated within a political order it did not control, that somewhere above the corporation there was an authority that could say no and make it stick. The corporate sovereignty zone ends the pretense. Not by arguing that corporations should govern. By building systems in which they already do, and inviting the states that nominally supervise them to recognize the arrangement in exchange for a share of what the arrangement produces. The corporate sovereignty zone begins as a concession. Specifically, a territorial concession made by a host state to a corporate entity, granting that entity the right to govern a defined geographic area under rules the corporate entity writes, enforces, and adjudicates, in exchange for development capital, infrastructure investment, employment generation, tax revenue, or some combination of these that the host state's government calculates as sufficient to justify the transfer of sovereign authority over the conceded territory. This is not a new arrangement. The East India Company operated on exactly this basis. So did the chartered companies of the colonial period, the Dutch East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Royal African Company, each a private entity holding public powers over defined territories, empowered to make law, conduct war, administer justice, and collect revenue within the terms of their charter. The Colonial Charter Company was the original corporate sovereignty zone. It was discredited, not because the model failed on its own terms, but because the imperial powers that chartered it were eventually pressured, through a century of anti-colonial struggle, to abandon the explicit claim that private entities could rightfully govern populations without those populations' consent. The corporate sovereignty zone is the charter company model restored, stripped of its colonial vocabulary, reclothed in the language of innovation and development, and deployed in a world where the populations being governed are, in theory, choosing to participate rather than being subjected by conquest. The theory of choice does not survive much scrutiny. But it survives enough. Enough to provide the political cover that distinguishes the contemporary corporate sovereignty zone from its colonial predecessor in the eyes of the international community that might otherwise object. The contemporary corporate sovereignty zone exists across a spectrum. At one end, the special economic zone, the most modest form, in which a defined territory operates under modified regulations that differ from the surrounding national context primarily in tax treatment, labor law applicability, and customs procedures. These are familiar. There are thousands of them globally. They are not, individually, alarming. They are the foot in the door. The foot in the door matters not because of what it currently admits but because of what the open door eventually admits, and because every subsequent step across the threshold is negotiated from the precedent of what was already conceded. At the middle of the spectrum, the charter city, the more ambitious form, in which a defined territory operates under a substantially different governance framework, with the corporate entity holding not just regulatory exemptions but positive governance authority, the right to write law, to establish courts, to administer police and security functions, to set the terms of residency and expulsion, to control physical infrastructure and access. The Charter City has been theorized extensively, piloted partially in multiple jurisdictions, and blocked repeatedly by the same political dynamic, the populations who live in or adjacent to the proposed territory discovering what is being proposed and objecting with sufficient force to halt the project. The objections have, so far, mostly worked. The objection that has so far worked is democratic. It operates through the existing political system, through the national governments whose approval is required for the territorial concession. As those national governments are progressively captured by the interests most invested in the Charter City model, the objections will stop working. At the far end of the spectrum, the full corporate sovereignty zone, the form that is not yet fully operational but toward which the trajectory of the spectrum clearly points, a defined territory, potentially substantial in size, governed entirely by a corporate entity with no meaningful accountability to any external democratic authority, with full sovereign powers over its territory and population, recognized by other sovereign entities as a legitimate governance structure on the basis of effective control rather than democratic legitimation. This end of the spectrum is where the compound becomes, in its most fully realized technocratic form, something that prior political theory has no adequate name for. The corporate sovereignty zone does not announce itself as governance. It announces itself as service. This is the rhetorical genius of the model, the reframing of the relationship between the zone and its inhabitants from a political relationship, citizen and state, governed and governing, to a commercial relationship, customer and provider, user and platform. The zone does not rule you. It serves you. It provides you with security, infrastructure, connectivity, healthcare, education, dispute resolution, all the functions that governance performs, but frames them as products, deliverables with service-level agreements, measurable against performance metrics, optimizable through user feedback, and subject to market competition from alternative providers who might serve you better. You are not a citizen subject to the zone's authority. You are a customer consuming the zone's services. The customer framing does several things simultaneously. It removes the language of rights. Customers do not have rights against their service providers. They have contracts. Contracts are enforceable according to their terms. Their terms were written by the service provider. It removes the language of legitimacy. Service providers do not require democratic legitimation. They require customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction is measured by whether customers remain, whether they choose to continue consuming the service. Voluntary participation substitutes for democratic consent. It removes the language of accountability. Service providers are accountable to their customers through market mechanisms, the threat of exit, of switching to a competitor, of the market signal of dissatisfaction. Democratic accountability, the ability to alter the governance structure itself through collective political action, is not a feature of the customer relationship. And it removes, most critically, the language of obligation. The state owes its citizens. The service provider owes its customers exactly what the contract specifies. When the contract ends, when the customer's value to the provider falls below the threshold of service, the relationship terminates. The customer is not owed continuation. They are owed what the contract guarantees. And the contract was written by the provider. The corporate sovereignty zone requires a specific type of host state to achieve its full operational form. Not a strong state. A fiscally desperate state. The model propagates most readily in contexts where the host state government faces severe resource constraints that make conventional public development impossible. The population requires infrastructure, employment, and services at a scale and speed the state cannot provide. The international development architecture, the IMF, the World Bank, bilateral development lenders, has attached to its assistance conditions that constrain the state's policy autonomy in ways that make the corporate sovereignty zone appear, comparatively, as a more favorable arrangement. And the political class of the host state has reached the threshold of desperation, pragmatism, or corruption, often some combination of all three, at which the transfer of sovereignty over a territory seems like a reasonable price for the development capital and political stability that the corporate zone promises. This is not a description of weak or failed states only. It is a description of a structural position that states across the development spectrum can find themselves in, and that the architects of the corporate sovereignty zone specifically create the conditions for. The conditions for corporate sovereignty zone entry are created by the same capital architecture that benefits from the zone's establishment: the withdrawal of productive investment from the territory, the accumulation of sovereign debt at terms that constrain policy autonomy, the systematic defunding of the public institutions that might otherwise provide what the zone promises to provide, until the state is desperate enough to accept the terms it would otherwise refuse. The desperation is not always manufactured. Sometimes it is found. But it is always, at minimum, carefully monitored, and the offer is made at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The corporate sovereignty zone's governance model is not democratic, but it is not autocratic in the traditional sense either. It is algorithmic. The zone is governed not by human rulers exercising discretionary authority but by systems encoding predetermined rules, optimized for the outcomes the zone's corporate structure has defined as desirable, applied consistently across the zone's population, and adjusted through processes that are technical rather than political. The algorithmic governance model has several advantages over both democratic and autocratic governance, from the perspective of those operating it. It is non-negotiable by design. Democratic governance is inherently negotiable; the capacity to alter the rules is the point. Autocratic governance is negotiable under sufficient pressure. History is full of autocrats who revised their positions when the pressure became existential. Algorithmic governance presents its rules as technical facts rather than political choices. The algorithm produces this outcome because the parameters specify this outcome, and the parameters are the product of technical optimization rather than political will. To argue with the outcome is to argue with the optimization, to claim that the function is wrongly specified, which requires technical engagement with a system whose specifications are proprietary. The governed cannot organize politically against an algorithm in the way they can organize against a ruler. The algorithm is not a political actor. It has no interests to appeal to. It has no legitimacy to withdraw. It simply computes. It scales perfectly. A human governor can manage a limited number of subjects. An algorithmic governance system manages millions of cases with identical attention and identical consistency. The corporate sovereignty zone can expand its territory and population without proportionally expanding its governance costs. The marginal cost of governing one more inhabitant is essentially the cost of adding them to the system. It optimizes continuously. Human governance systems adapt slowly, through legislative processes, through bureaucratic revision, through the accumulation of judicial precedent. Algorithmic governance systems update rapidly, through parameter adjustment, through machine learning on outcome data, through continuous optimization toward defined targets. The zone's governance gets better, by its own metrics, continuously. The question of whether those metrics measure what the governed would choose to have measured, whether the optimization target aligns with the interests of those being optimized over, is not a question the algorithmic governance system is designed to answer. It is a political question. And the algorithmic governance system is specifically designed to make political questions technically unanswerable. The corporate sovereignty zone's relationship to the surrounding state is not subordination. It is not independence. It is extraction without integration. The zone extracts from the host state territorial legitimacy. The host state's recognition of the zone's authority lends it a degree of international standing it could not achieve as a purely private entity. Labor supply. The surrounding population provides the workforce for the zone's functions that are not yet automated. Market access. The surrounding economy provides customers, suppliers, and partners for the zone's economic activities. And infrastructure connection, roads, ports. Communications links that connect the zone to the global economy. The zone does not integrate with the host state, its governance is separate, its legal system is separate, its fiscal architecture is separate. The zone's revenues flow to the corporate structure, not to the host state's treasury, beyond the terms of whatever revenue sharing was agreed in the initial concession, and its political accountability is separate, or rather, absent in the sense the host state's population might understand accountability to function. The host state gets what it negotiated. The zone gets everything the host state couldn't extract from its own territory plus the legitimating cover of the host state's sovereign recognition. The relationship is colonial in its structure while being formally voluntary in its framing. The host state consented. The host state's population, whose territory is being conceded, may or may not have been consulted, and consultation, where it occurred, was structured in ways that made refusal difficult to coordinate and costly to sustain. Inside the corporate sovereignty zone, a specific form of social order emerges, one that differs from both the democratic state and the military enclave in ways that reveal the corporate zone's particular character. The military enclave is organized around threat. Its social architecture reflects the preoccupations of security, hierarchy, loyalty, discipline, the management of the perimeter. The corporate sovereignty zone is organized around value. Its social architecture reflects the preoccupations of productivity, meritocracy, cognitive contribution, the management of output. Inside the zone, inhabitants are stratified not by loyalty but by measurable value creation. The engineers and designers and executives who generate the intellectual output the zone is organized to produce receive the highest tier of services, the most complete security, the greatest autonomy within the zone's parameters. Below them, the operational class, the managers, the technicians, the skilled workers, whose contributions are necessary but not unique, whose positions are secure as long as their performance metrics hold, whose security is contingent rather than absolute. Below them, the service class, the workers performing functions not yet automated, whose presence in the zone is conditional on availability, whose residency is temporary by design, who live in the zone but are not of it, commuting from the surrounding territory or housed in designated zones that are physically within the perimeter but governance within a different tier of the zone's service architecture. Below them, the automated systems, not a human tier at all, but present in the zone's social architecture as a constant reminder of the direction of travel, of what every human tier is competing against for continued inclusion. The zone does not conceal this stratification. It celebrates it. It presents it as the honest expression of a meritocratic order, each person receiving exactly what their value generates, the system perfectly calibrated to reward contribution and remove inefficiency. What it does not present, what it is architecturally designed not to present, is the question of who designed the value metrics, whose preferences they encode, whose contributions they systematically undervalue, and what alternative metrics might reveal about who is actually creating what for whom. The metrics are not neutral. The metrics are the politics of the corporate sovereignty zone, encoded in technical language, enforced by automated systems, and presented as objective fact to a population that has, by entering the zone, agreed to be evaluated by them. The corporate sovereignty zone's most powerful innovation is not technical. It is the solution to the oldest legitimation problem of non-democratic governance. How do you maintain the governed's acceptance of a system they did not choose and cannot meaningfully alter? Prior non-democratic systems answered this with ideology, the claim that the governing structure embodies a truth that transcends democratic preference; tradition, the claim that the governing structure's authority derives from historical continuity that precedes and exceeds any individual's right to question; fear, the claim, enforced in practice, that the cost of non-acceptance exceeds the cost of acceptance. The corporate sovereignty zone answers with quality of life. The zone works by the metrics that matter to the inhabitants it has selected: security, connectivity, healthcare quality, aesthetic environment, cognitive stimulation, social homogeneity, career opportunity. The zone works better than anywhere else available to them. The inhabitants do not need to believe in the zone's governance. They need only prefer it to the alternative. And the alternative is the outside. And the outside is getting worse. Every improvement in the outside would weaken the zone's legitimation mechanism, would reduce the preference differential that makes the zone's non-democratic governance tolerable. The zone therefore has a structural interest in the deterioration of the outside. Not an active interest, the zone need not deliberately worsen the outside. Simply a passive interest, the zone benefits from the outside's deterioration and has no incentive to prevent it. This is the corporate sovereignty zone's most honest political statement, the one it will never make in its promotional materials. Our legitimacy is your misery. We do not need you to believe we are right. We need you to know that outside is worse. As long as outside is worse, you will choose us, and your choice is our democracy. The corporate sovereignty zone's ultimate destination, the form it is tending toward as its governance architecture matures and its dependencies on the host state diminish, is full sovereignty. Not declared sovereignty. Operational sovereignty. The condition in which the zone controls, within its territory and its network of managed zones, every essential function of governance, and the host state's nominal sovereignty over the territory is a legal fiction sustained by the host state's continued receipt of whatever the zone has agreed to pay for the fiction's continuation. This is not unprecedented. It is the condition that the East India Company achieved in Bengal in the 18th century, full operative sovereignty over a substantial territory within the nominal sovereignty of a Mughal empire that retained the name of authority while the company held its substance. The company eventually became uncomfortable with the fiction and moved to formalize its authority, a move that generated the political crisis that led to the Crown's assumption of direct governance. The contemporary corporate sovereignty zone will not make that mistake. It will not formalize. It will not claim. It will simply operate, expanding its operative authority one concession at a time, one automated system at a time, one reduced dependency on the host state at a time, until the formality of the host state's sovereignty is the only thing distinguishing the zone from what it functionally already is. A sovereign entity answering to no democratic public, governed by no elected authority, accountable to no constituency except the capital structure that owns it. There is a word for a territory governed by a private entity for the private entity's benefit, in which the resident population has no political standing, no democratic recourse, and no claim on the governing structure beyond what the governing structure has agreed to provide. The word is not innovation. The word is not charter. The word is not zone. The word is older. The word carries weight that the corporate sovereignty zone's architects have worked very carefully to ensure does not attach to their project. They have largely succeeded. The language of innovation is powerful. The language of choice is powerful. The language of service and optimization and meritocracy and platform is powerful enough to describe the same arrangement that prior language described differently and make it sound like progress rather than restoration. But the arrangement is the arrangement. And the arrangement, in its consequences for those subject to it without recourse against it, is the arrangement it has always been. However new the walls, however sophisticated the censors, however elegant the governance algorithm that decides, without appeal, who stays and who goes and what the difference between the two was always worth. The corporation said, "We are not a government," and it was true. The corporation said, "We are a service provider," and it was true. The corporation said, "You chose to be here," and it was true. The corporation said, "You can leave," and it was true, in the sense that the door opens outward and no one will stop you, and what is outside the door is what is outside the door, and you knew what was outside the door when you chose to come in. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth is what you discover when you reach for the governance and find a service agreement, when you reach for the rights and find a contract, when you reach for the democracy and find a metric, when you reach for the exit and remember what you left behind to enter, and realize that leaving means returning to what you left, which is why you enter it in the first place, and the door that opens outward has always opened onto exactly that, the reason you came in. 12. Algorithmic citizenship. Citizenship was always a sorting mechanism. This is the truth that the language of universal rights was built, in part, to obscure, not maliciously, but necessarily, because the sorting mechanism required legitimation, and legitimation required a vocabulary that pointed away from the sorting toward the solidarity. We the people, libet, egalite, fraternite, all men are created equal. The we. The all. The universal. Powerful language. Language that moved populations, that justified revolutions, that built the institutional architecture of the modern democratic state. Language that was also, always, doing something else simultaneously, defining the boundary of the we, specifying who counted as all, determining whose equality was actionable and whose was aspirational pending further political development that somehow never fully arrived. Citizenship sorted. It sorted by birth, by blood, by territory, by the legal status of one's parents at the moment of one's emergence into a world that had already decided, before you arrived, which side of which line you were on and what that meant for every subsequent transaction between you and the state. The sorting was never fully rational. Birth location is not a measure of value. Parentage is not a measure of contribution. The accident of geography is not a measure of anything except geography. Citizenship sorting was the sorting of inheritance, of the lottery of birth, made consequential by the state's decision to attach rights, protections, obligations, and identity to the accident of where and to whom you happen to arrive. This irrationality was always visible. Philosophers complained about it. Cosmopolitan thinkers proposed alternatives. The borders of citizenship were contested, extended, redrawn, violated, and defended across the entire history of the modern state. But the irrationality persisted because the alternative, citizenship granted on the basis of something other than birth, raised a question the democratic state was never quite willing to answer directly. On the basis of what, exactly, would you sort? The algorithmic citizenship system has an answer. It sorts on the basis of value. Measured continuously. Calculated precisely. Updated in real time. Expressed as a number. The algorithmic citizenship score is not, in its initial presentation, a citizenship score. It is a credit score. A health score. A productivity index. A social contribution metric. A cognitive value assessment. A security clearance level. A residency tier classification. It arrives, in the corporate sovereignty zone, as a set of parallel systems, each measuring a different dimension of the inhabitant's relationship to the zone's operational requirements, that are, individually, unremarkable, and collectively, constitution. The credit scoring system determines access to capital. The health monitoring system determines medical resource allocation. The productivity system determines compensation and advancement. The social contribution metric determines access to community resources. The cognitive value assessment determines residency tier. The security clearance determines physical access within the zone. The residency tier determines the totality of the inhabitant's standing, what they can access, where they can go, what services they receive, how long they may remain. Each system, separately, has precedent in the existing world. Credit scores exist. Health monitoring exists. Performance reviews exist. Security clearances exist. What is new is not any individual system but their integration, the fusion of all these separate measurements into a single continuous assessment of the inhabitant's value to the zone, updated in real time, determining, through automated processes, every significant parameter of the inhabitant's life within the compound. This is algorithmic citizenship, the replacement of the status of citizen, fixed, inherited, not subject to continuous performance review, with the status of scored inhabitant, dynamic, earned, subject to continuous assessment, always one metric's decline away from reclassification. The algorithmic citizenship system has a theory of the person. Every governance system has a theory of the person, an embedded model of what human beings are, what they need, what they owe, what they are owed, what makes them valuable and what makes them a burden. The democratic state's theory of the person was, each person has inherent dignity. That dignity is not contingent on contribution. It is not revocable by performance failure. It generates rights that the state is obligated to protect regardless of the person's economic utility. The homeless person has the same political standing as the billionaire. The unproductive has the same vote as the productive. The child has the same claim on the state's protection as the adult who generates tax revenue. The theory was honored imperfectly. Democratic states violated it constantly, in their treatment of the poor, the marginalized, the criminal, the foreign. But the violation was always a violation, it could be named as such, contested as such, litigated against the standard that the theory provided. The theory was the ground of critique. The algorithmic citizenship system's theory of the person is different. Each person has measurable value. That value is determined by the person's contribution to the zone's defined objectives, productivity, innovation, security compliance, social cohesion, resource efficiency. The person's standing within the zone is a function of their measured value. Standing rises with value. Standing falls with value. When value falls below the zone's threshold for continued inclusion, standing falls to zero, which is to say, residency ends. This theory is not cruel in its self-presentation. It is meritocratic. It presents itself as the honest application of the principle that standing should reflect contribution, that the person who contributes more should receive more, and the person who contributes nothing has no claim on the resources of those who contribute. Merit. Contribution. Value. The language is aspirational. The architecture is exclusion. What does the algorithmic citizenship score actually measure? The question is deceptively simple. The answer reveals everything about the zone's theory of value, and about who benefits from that theory. Productivity metrics. Output volume. Quality scores. Innovation contribution. The measurable results of the inhabitants' labor within the zone's economic structure. But productivity is measured against benchmarks set by the zone's governing structure, benchmarks that reflect the governing structure's understanding of what constitutes valuable output. The work that is difficult to measure, care work, community building, mentorship, the maintenance of social fabric, is systematically underweighted not because it is less valuable but because it is less legible to measurement systems designed by and for those whose work is most measurable. The productivity metric is not neutral. It is a political choice wearing the costume of a technical measurement. Compliance metrics. Adherence to zone regulations. Security protocol compliance. Resource consumption within allocated parameters. The compliance metric rewards conformity, the precise alignment of behavior with established norms. It penalizes deviation, including the kinds of deviation that, in other contexts, would be called innovation, dissent, creativity, moral integrity. The person who follows the rules scores well on compliance. The person who questions the rules does not. In a democratic system, questioning the rules is the mechanism through which bad rules become better rules. In the algorithmic citizenship system, questioning the rules is a score penalty. The mechanism of democratic improvement is the behavior that the scoring system is designed to discourage. Social metrics. Peer ratings. Community contribution scores. Conflict indices. The social metric is the most intimate surveillance the scoring system conducts, and the most politically consequential. Who rates the peer? The peer's colleagues. The peer's neighbors. The peer's competitors for the same limited tier of resources. The peer who gives a low rating improves their own relative position. The peer who gives a high rating to someone more capable is signaling their own inadequacy. The social metric does not measure social contribution. It measures social conformity, the degree to which the inhabitant is liked by people who have a structural incentive to like them less than their actual contribution warrants. The effect is the systematic suppression of the unusual, the eccentric, the difficult, the challenging, the human qualities that produce innovation and moral progress and civilizational renewal, in favor of the agreeable, the conforming, the non-threatening. The zone optimizes itself, through the social metric, toward a population that generates no friction. And a population that generates no friction is a population that generates no correction of its own errors. Health metrics. Biometric data. Medical compliance. Longevity indicators. Cognitive performance. The health metric is the most intimate physically and the most revealing structurally. The zone monitors the inhabitant's body, continuously, through wearables and environmental sensors, through regular cognitive assessments, through the medical systems that know more about the inhabitant's physical condition than the inhabitant does. This data feeds the score. The inhabitant whose biometrics suggest declining productivity, whose cognitive performance is trending downward, whose longevity indicators are moving in the wrong direction, sees their score move accordingly. The body is not separate from citizenship. The body is citizenship. The body's performance is the citizen's standing. The body's decline is the citizen's expulsion. The zone does not wait for the person to become less valuable. It predicts the trajectory and adjusts the standing preemptively. Not because it is cruel. Because it is efficient. The algorithmic citizenship score creates a specific social psychology that prior governance systems produced only partially and only through cruder mechanisms. Call it performative selfhood, the condition in which the inhabitant does not live their life but performs it, continuously, for the measurement system that is always watching. Every prior totalitarian system attempted to produce performative selfhood through surveillance and social pressure, the fear of the informant, the neighbor who might report, the system that rewarded denunciation and penalized privacy. The algorithmic citizenship system produces it more completely and more efficiently through the simple transparency of the score. The inhabitant knows the score exists. The inhabitant knows the score is updating continuously. The inhabitant knows what the score determines: residency tier, resource access, security clearance, medical priority. The inhabitant therefore organizes their behavior around the score, not because a guard is watching, but because the score is always watching, and the score's consequences are immediate and precise in a way that the neighbor's potential denunciation never was. The scoring system does not need to enforce behavior. The inhabitant enforces it themselves. This is the automation of compliance, not through threat of punishment but through the internalization of the measurement as the primary frame through which the self is understood. The inhabitant does not ask, "What do I want to do?" The inhabitant asks, "What will this do to my score?" Identity is replaced by metric. The self becomes a portfolio to be managed, maintained, optimized, protected against decline, rather than a person to be expressed, developed, risked, changed. The zone produces, through the scoring system, exactly the population it needs: highly productive, highly compliant, deeply invested in their own continuous self-optimization, and structurally unable to organize collectively around any interest that conflicts with their individual score management. Because collective action, the coordination of individuals around a shared interest that overrides individual calculation, requires precisely the willingness to risk the score that the scoring system is designed to make rationally unaffordable. The score kills solidarity by making individual performance more important than collective action, every time, for everyone, automatically, without coercion. The algorithmic citizenship score is also a market. Or rather, it creates one. When standing is quantified, quantified standing can be traded. The secondary market for algorithmic citizenship scores, for the enhancement of the score through purchased services, professional score optimization, score insurance, score reputation management, emerges wherever the primary scoring system exists. The person with capital can purchase score improvement through the services the zone makes available for purchase: cognitive enhancement subscriptions, health optimization programs, productivity coaching systems, compliance monitoring services that alert you before a behavior reduces your score rather than after. The person without capital cannot purchase these services. Their score declines on the natural trajectory of unenhanced human performance, which is to say, it declines as they age, as they face circumstances, as the zone's benchmark rises to reflect the performance of the enhanced inhabitants whose capital has purchased improvement. The algorithmic citizenship score presents itself as meritocratic. It measures contribution. It rewards performance. It does not acknowledge, it is architecturally designed not to acknowledge, that the ability to perform at the level the score rewards is itself distributed by prior capital, that the starting position in the score system correlates perfectly with the resources available to enhance performance, that the meritocracy the score claims to measure is a meritocracy of prior advantage expressed through the neutral language of objective measurement. The score makes inequality look like difference in value. The difference in value looks like difference in contribution. The difference in contribution looks like difference in merit. And merit is the one principle that the zone's inhabitants, selected for their belief in meritocracy, their willingness to be evaluated by it, their stake in a system that ranks them highly, will not question. Because to question merit is to question their own standing. And their standing is their life inside the compound. And their life inside the compound is the alternative to the outside. And the outside is what it is. So the score is not questioned. The score is managed, optimized, protected. And the inequality it encodes persists, and deepens, and is called by the name the zone gives it. Performance differential. The algorithmic citizenship score has a political function beyond the management of the zone's internal population. It is the zone's answer to the question that every governance system must eventually answer. Who belongs? Democratic citizenship answered, those born here, or those admitted through defined legal process, or those who have completed the prescribed path to naturalization. The answer was often unjust in its application. But it was stable, it did not change based on the citizen's performance, and the path to full inclusion, once completed, was not reversible by administrative decision. Algorithmic citizenship answers, those who currently score above the threshold. The answer is dynamic, it changes with the score. Inclusion is never completed. Belonging is never secured. The inhabitant who scored well yesterday must score well today and tomorrow and in every assessment cycle for the duration of their residency. There is no arrival. There is only performance. The psychological consequence of this, the substitution of perpetual performance for the secure belonging that citizenship once provided, is a specific form of anxiety that the zone produces in its inhabitants as a structural feature rather than an incidental side effect. The anxious inhabitant is the productive inhabitant. The inhabitant who knows their belonging is contingent works harder to secure it than the inhabitant who knows their belonging is guaranteed. The zone's productivity optimization and the zone's denial of secure belonging are not separate design choices. They are the same design choice. The anxiety is the engine. What happens to the inhabitant when the score falls below the threshold? The process is calibrated to avoid the optics of expulsion. There is no guard who comes to the door. No formal notice of deportation. No public event around which outrage can organize. There is instead a gradient of diminishment. First, tier reclassification. The inhabitant's residency tier drops. Services reduce, not eliminated, reduced. The healthcare access is still there but the priority is lower. The housing allocation is still there but the location is less favorable. The community access is still there but some spaces are now restricted. The reclassification is communicated through the zone's administrative system, a notification, revised access profile, an updated parameter set in the inhabitant score dashboard. The inhabitant understands what has happened. The inhabitant understands what continued decline will produce. The inhabitant has a defined period to reverse the trajectory. The period is defined by the zone's system. The reversal criteria are defined by the zone's system. The assessment of whether reversal has occurred is conducted by the zone's system. There is no appeal to a human authority. There is no human authority to appeal to. There is the system and its parameters and the inhabitant's relationship to those parameters and the system's assessment of that relationship and the outcome the system's assessment produces. Second, resource reduction. If the trajectory does not reverse, the resource reduction deepens. Access to the zone's premium services, the longevity medicine, the cognitive augmentation, the highest quality educational systems for the inhabitants' children, is suspended pending score improvement. The children. The children's access to the zone's premier educational systems, the systems designed to produce the next generation of high-scoring inhabitants, is contingent on the parent's score. The child does not choose the parent's performance. The child inherits its consequences. The meritocracy, at this point, reveals the inheritance structure underneath it. The high-scoring parent's child has access to the systems that produce high-scoring children. The declining parent's child loses that access. The score is presented as individually earned. It is structurally transmitted. Third, residency suspension. If the trajectory still does not reverse, residency status moves to provisional, the formal classification that precedes exit. The provisional resident has a defined window. The window's closure is automatic. The exit is, by the time it occurs, the mathematical conclusion of a process that has been running for however many assessment cycles the system's parameters specify. Not a decision made by a human authority that a human being has wronged another human being, but the automatic output of a system processing an input that has fallen below a defined threshold. The inhabitant does not leave in disgrace. There is no one to disgrace them. The system simply reclassifies their status. The reclassification closes the access. The closed access makes remaining impossible. They leave. The system records voluntary departure. And in the technical sense, it is The algorithmic citizenship system's most consequential effect is not on the inhabitants it processes. It is on the concept of citizenship itself, on what belonging means, what standing means, what the relationship between the person and the governance structure is understood to be. Democratic citizenship, at its most aspirational, was the proposition that the governed constitute the source of governing authority, that the state derives its legitimacy from the people and is therefore, in some fundamental sense, theirs. The state belongs to the citizens. The citizens do not belong to the state. Algorithmic citizenship inverts this. The zone does not belong to the inhabitants. The inhabitants belong in the zone conditionally, temporarily, for exactly as long as the score says so. The inhabitants' relationship to the zone is not one of ownership or authorship or membership. It is one of tenancy, performance contingent tenancy, in which the terms are set by the landlord, the performance criteria are defined by the landlord, the assessment is conducted by the landlord, and the decision to continue or terminate is the landlord's prerogative, expressed not through personal decision but through system output that no one is responsible for and no one can appeal. When citizenship becomes tenancy, when belonging becomes performance, when standing becomes score, the governed are not only stripped of political power. They are stripped of the one thing that political power, at its best, was for. The security of knowing that you belong here, that this is yours, that your standing in the community of the governed does not depend on tomorrow's assessment of yesterday's performance. That you are not a variable in the system's optimization. That you are a person. A person to whom the system is accountable. Not a data point to which the system is indifferent. The score knows you better than you know yourself. This is what they said when they introduced it. The score knows your health trajectory before your symptoms appear. The score knows your productivity ceiling before you reach it. The score knows your social value before the community has assessed it. The score knows, and because the score knows, the score decides, and because the score decides, you do not have to. This is the gift they said it was: freedom from uncertainty. Freedom from the anxiety of not knowing where you stand. The score tells you where you stand. The score tells you exactly what they did not say. What the score's architecture prevented them from having to say is what you lose when the score knows and decides and tells. You lose the not knowing, which sounds like a loss of nothing. Until you understand that the not knowing was the spacey in which you were more than your last measurement. In which you could be worse than your score today and better than your score tomorrow. And something the score had not yet learned to measure the day after that. The score closes that space, fills it with precision, and precision in the space where a person used to be, is not clarity. It is erasure. 13. Entry by cognitive value. Every gate has a theory. The gate of the ancient city had a theory of threat, armed men, hostile formations, the visual grammar of invasion. The guard at the gate read bodies for weapons, read groups for coordination, read faces for the specific quality of intention that distinguished the trader from the raider. The theory was crude. It misclassified constantly. It was bribed, deceived, exhausted, overwhelmed. But it was a theory, an embedded model of who should enter and who should not, expressed in the architecture of the gate and the judgment of the person standing in it. The gate of the nation-state had a theory of belonging, documents, lineage, the bureaucratic record of prior affiliation. The passport. The visa. The entry stamp. The theory was categorical: you belong to a nation, and nations had agreements, and agreements determined whether the gate opened. The theory was also crude. It sorted on the accident of birth, on the political relationships between governments, on the economic interests of receiving states expressed through immigration quotas that bore only partial relationship to any coherent theory of human value. But it was a theory. And it was, critically, a theory in which the gate's opening was not contingent on the individual's demonstrated worth, in which belonging to the right category was sufficient for entry regardless of what you would contribute once inside. The gate of the technocratic charter stronghold has a different theory. Not threat. Not belonging. Value. Specifically, cognitive value, the measurable, accessible, rankable contribution that the entering individual is projected to make to the compound's defined objectives, based on their demonstrated capabilities, their assessed trajectory, their compatibility with the compound's current and anticipated operational requirements. The gate opens not because you are safe. Not because you belong. Because you are worth it. And the calculation of worth is the most consequential political act the compound performs, the act in which all of its values, all of its theories of the human, all of its visions of the future it is building for those inside, are made concrete, one admission decision at a time. The entry by cognitive value system did not emerge fully formed. It emerged from three converging streams that each, separately, appeared reasonable, and whose convergence produced something that none of them, separately, would have endorsed if named directly. The first stream, talent attraction. Every organization, corporation, university, city, nation, has always sought to attract the most capable people available. This is unremarkable. The remarkable thing is what happens when the organization's ability to select for capability becomes sufficiently precise and sufficiently consequential that selection transforms from preference into policy, from the organization preferring the talented to the organization being constituted by the talented in a way that structurally excludes all others. The technology company that began by hiring the best engineers and found that its entire culture, governance structure, and internal economy had been organized around the specific preferences and capabilities of that hiring pool, that the company was not a company that happened to employ talented people but a talent structure that happened to be organized as a company, is the organizational prototype of the entry by cognitive value compound. The second stream, human capital theory. The economic framework that treats people as capital, as bundles of skills, knowledge, and productive potential whose value can be assessed, developed, and depreciated over the course of a working life, provided the conceptual infrastructure for treating entry as investment. If people are capital, then admitting people is a capital allocation decision. Capital allocation decisions should be optimized, directed toward the highest value assets, away from low value or depreciating assets. The entry decision is therefore not a political decision about membership in a community. It is an investment decision about the quality of the compound's human capital portfolio. Human capital theory never intended this conclusion. It was developed to argue for investment in education and training, to make the case that improving human capabilities was economically rational. But the framework it provided, the framework of persons as capital, of human worth as measurable economic value, is the framework that the entry by cognitive value system deploys with full consistency, following the logic further than its originators were willing to follow it. The third stream, assessment technology. The ability to measure cognitive capability has expanded enormously, from crude IQ testing through standardized academic assessment through psychometric evaluation through the continuous behavioral data capture that modern digital systems enable. The compound's entry assessment does not rely on a single test taken on a single day. It draws on the full dataset of the applicant's measurable cognitive and behavioral history, educational performance across their lifetime, professional output assessed against field benchmarks, cognitive performance on standardized assessments, social contribution metrics from prior residency contexts, health and longevity projections from biometric data, and the predictive models the compound has built from the performance data of its existing population, models that identify, with claimed precision, which combinations of current characteristics predict the specific kinds of future contribution the compound requires. The assessment technology presents itself as objective. It is more comprehensive than any prior assessment. It is therefore more persuasive as objective. But comprehensiveness is not objectivity. Comprehensive measurement of the wrong things is comprehensive error. And the things being measured, the dimensions of human capability the compound has defined as valuable, are not discovered by the assessment. They are chosen by the compound. What does the compound assess when it assesses cognitive value? The category is presented as unified, cognitive value, as though intelligence were a single dimension along which people could be ranked from most to least valuable. It is not a single dimension. It is a cluster of capabilities that the compound has selected, from the full range of human cognitive possibility, based on the compound's specific operational requirements, and whose selection reveals, with the precision of any consequential choice, exactly what the compound is and exactly what it is not. Assessed positively. Analytical capability. The ability to decompose complex problems into tractable components, to model systems, to identify the critical variable in a multivariable situation. This capability is measurable, well understood, and directly applicable to the compound's technical and governance functions. Innovative generation. The ability to produce novel solutions, to see the unobvious connection, to generate options rather than select among given ones. The compound requires this capability to maintain the competitive advantage of its technical architecture against the adaptive pressure of the outside. Systemic optimization. The ability to improve existing systems, to look at a functioning process and identify the inefficiency, the bottleneck, the parameter that if adjusted would improve the output. This is the capability of the engineer rather than the architect, but the compound requires both and assesses both. Strategic modeling. The ability to think across time, to model not the immediate situation but its trajectory, not the current state but the range of future states it might produce. The compound's governing structure prizes this capability because compound survival is a long-horizon problem. Technical execution. The ability to implement, to convert design into working system, to build what the analytical and innovative capabilities have conceived. The compound requires builders as well as thinkers, and assesses execution capability alongside conceptual capability. Assessed neutrally or not at all. Empathic capability. The ability to model another person's internal state, to understand, from the inside, what it is to be in another's position. This capability is not well measured by the compound's assessment systems. It does not contribute directly to measurable outputs. It is not weighted in the entry calculation. The compound does not intend to exclude empathic people. It simply fails to assess for empathy and therefore does not select for it. The consequence is the same as intended exclusion. The compound's population is, over time, systematically depleted of the capability most responsible for the kinds of social and moral intelligence that prevent systems from causing harm they cannot perceive. Practical wisdom. The ability to navigate ambiguous situations with good judgment, not analytical judgment, which the compound assesses, but moral and social judgment, which requires the kind of contextual sensitivity that does not express itself well in standardized assessment. Not measured. Not weighted. Narrative capability. The ability to understand and create meaning through story, to make sense of human experience in ways that analysis cannot reach. The compound does not see the value of this capability in operational terms. It is not assessed. The compound's population will be, over time, technically sophisticated and narratively impoverished, capable of optimizing anything and meaning nothing. Collective intelligence. The ability to make groups smarter than their individual members, the organizational, facilitative, connective capability that produces emergent collective capacity. This capability is systematically undervalued by individual assessment systems, because it is not a property of individuals but of the relationships between them. The compound assesses individuals. It therefore cannot assess for the capability that emerges between them. Assess negatively. Dissent capability. The ability and willingness to challenge existing frameworks, to see what everyone else has agreed to see and say that it is wrong. This capability does not score well on compliance metrics. It creates friction in the social assessment. It is not listed as a negative assessment criterion. It simply doesn't fit the profile. And the compound, selecting for fit, selects against it without ever specifying that it has done so. The compound's entry system is therefore not selecting for intelligence. It is selecting for a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that is useful to the compound's current operations, comfortable with the compound's existing frameworks, and unlikely to generate the internal pressure that would require the compound to change. It is selecting for cognitive workers who are also, by the structure of the selection, cognitively compliant. The entry assessment takes place across a defined sequence. Preliminary screening. The applicant's publicly available data profile, educational history, professional output, published work, patent filings, citation records, digital behavioral signature across the compound's partner platforms, is assessed against the compound's minimum threshold criteria. This screening is automated. The applicant does not interact with a human reviewer. The compound system processes the available data and either advances the applicant or does not. The rejected applicant receives a notification. The notification does not explain the grounds for rejection. The grounds are proprietary. The assessment criteria are proprietary. The weighting of criteria is proprietary. The applicant cannot know what they failed to demonstrate because they cannot know what the system was looking for. The system does not owe them an explanation. The system is not a public institution. It is a private assessment mechanism serving a private governance structure. The rejection is not an adverse action in any legal sense that the existing international framework recognizes. It is simply the absence of an offer. Deep assessment. The applicants who pass preliminary screening are invited to participate in a comprehensive evaluation, a period of assessment typically lasting several weeks, conducted partly in person at the compound's assessment facility and partly through remote monitoring systems that the applicant has agreed, by accepting the assessment invitation, to submit to. The remote monitoring period is not announced as surveillance. It is announced as contextual assessment, the compound's system observing the applicant in their natural environment to supplement the structured assessment data with behavioral information that structured assessment cannot capture. What the compound observes during contextual assessment. How the applicant behaves when they believe they are not being assessed. How the applicant treats people with less power than them. How the applicant manages stress, uncertainty, and failure. How the applicant's stated values align with their observed behavior. This data is valuable. It is also collected without the applicant's meaningful understanding of what is being observed, how it is weighted, or what behavioral conclusions the system is drawing from the observations it makes. The applicant has consented to assessment. They have not consented to the specific inferences being drawn from the specific data being collected, because those inferences are proprietary and their disclosure would compromise the assessment's validity. Compatibility modeling. The final stage of assessment is not an evaluation of the individual in isolation but a modeling of the individual in relation to the compound's existing population. The question is not only, is this person valuable? The question is this person valuable here, in this specific compound, at this specific moment in its development, given the specific capabilities already present and the specific gaps the compound has identified? This modeling step is where the entry assessment becomes most explicitly a population management function, where the individual applicant is evaluated not as a person but as a potential addition to a managed community whose composition the compound is continuously optimizing. The compound might reject a highly capable applicant because the compound currently has sufficient capability in their area and insufficient capability in another. The compound might accept a less capable applicant because their specific combination of skills complements the existing population's profile in ways that a more individually impressive applicant does not. This is, in principle, rational portfolio management. It is also, in practice, the explicit treatment of people as components in a design system, as interchangeable, within categories, as redundant, when the category is full, as desirable or undesirable not because of their individual humanity but because of their fit within the compound's optimization target. The cognitive value entry threshold is not fixed. It rises. This is the feature of the entry by cognitive value system that its architects are most reluctant to discuss and that has the most significant long-term consequences for both the compound and the outside. The threshold rises because the compound's existing population continuously improves, through augmentation, through training, through the cognitive enhancement technologies the compound provides to its inhabitants and the selective recruitment of high-capability individuals from the outside. As the existing population improves, the marginal value of a new addition must be higher to justify the resource cost of admission. The threshold adjusts to the population's improving baseline. What was sufficient for entry last year is insufficient this year. What is sufficient this year will be insufficient next year. The rising threshold has several consequences that the compound's architects understand and the outside does not. For the compound, the population becomes continuously more capable by its own metrics. The compound's internal cognitive environment improves. The design class becomes more sophisticated. The governance systems become better calibrated. The compound's competitive advantage over the outside, in technical capability, in problem-solving capacity, in the quality of its internal discourse, widens every year. For the outside, the pool of people who qualify for entry shrinks every year. Not because people outside the compound are becoming less capable, the same AI tools that augment the compound's population are available, in attenuated form, to the outside. but the compound's threshold rises faster than the outside's accessible augmentation improves. The gap widens. The people who might once have qualified, who are, by any prior standard, exceptionally capable, find themselves below a threshold that has moved beyond them without announcement. For those near the threshold, a specific and particularly cruel pressure. The person whose capability is just below the current threshold is not simply excluded. They are close enough to see the compound clearly, to understand what is inside, to have the cognitive equipment to analyze what the compound represents, and far enough to be denied entry. This is not the abandoned majority's condition, which is distance from the compound's world. This is proximity without admission, the condition of being capable enough to understand the gate and not capable enough to open it. This is the most politically volatile position in the entry by cognitive value world. Not the distant poor, who lack the tools to organize their grievance, but the near qualified, the engineers who scored 92nd percentile when the threshold was 95th, the researchers whose output is excellent but not excellent enough, the designers whose work the compound uses without offering its designers entry. These are the people with the capability to understand exactly what is happening, the analytical tools to model its trajectory, the proximity to the compound to observe it clearly, and the exclusion that gives them every reason to organize against it. The compound knows this. The compound monitors this population carefully. The compound's entry system includes, at the proprietary level it does not discuss, an assessment of the applicant's political orientation toward the compound itself. The brilliant dissident is not admitted. Not because brilliance is insufficient. Because dissidence is a score factor. And the score factor is proprietary. And the applicant will never know it was the reason. The entry system produces a specific geography of cognitive distribution across the compound and the outside that has no historical precedent in its clarity and its intentionality. Prior cognitive stratification was a consequence, the unintended byproduct of economic systems, educational access differentials, geographic accident, the accumulated advantages of inheritance and social capital. Cognitive stratification by compound entry is a design. The compound is deliberately concentrating cognitive capability, in the specific dimensions it values, inside its perimeter, while the capability it does not value and the capability that falls below its threshold accumulates outside. The outside is not cognitively empty. The outside contains enormous intelligence, informs the compound does not measure, across dimensions the compound does not value, organized toward problems the compound has decided are not its concern. But the outside is cognitively depleted of precisely the capabilities the compound most prizes, because those capabilities are the compound's most active target for recruitment and extraction. The compound does not extract them with force. It offers them a threshold. And the people who meet the threshold have, in most cases, already been depleted of loyalty to the communities that formed them, by educational systems that rewarded individual performance over collective contribution, by economic systems that rewarded mobility over rootedness, by the entire infrastructure of meritocratic aspiration that prepared them, throughout their lives, to be selected. The compound did not build this infrastructure. It simply harvested it. The outside built the people the compound admits. The outside funded their education, provided the social environment that developed their capabilities, offered the challenges against which they refined their skills. The outside invested in them. The compound takes them. Not through coercion. Through the offer. And the offer is better than what the outside can match, because the compound has built it to be exactly that. The most important question the entry by cognitive value system never asks, the question its assessment architecture is specifically designed to not require answering, is valuable to whom? The assessment measures cognitive value. Cognitive value in the service of the compound's objectives. The compound's objectives as defined by the compound's governing structure. The governing structure defines objectives that serve the governing structure. The governing structure's objectives are not democratically derived. They are not accountable to the compound's inhabitants. They are not accountable to the outside population whose cognitive talent the compound extracts. They are not accountable to any public interest that the compound has not defined as its own. The entry system is therefore not selecting for humanity's most cognitively capable people in any universal sense. It is selecting for the most cognitively capable people in relation to a specific and privately defined set of goals, and treating that selection as though it were the identification of an objective natural hierarchy of human value. The meritocracy claims to measure worth. It measures usefulness to a specific structure, for a specific purpose, defined by specific people, who are not accountable to the population being assessed. This gap, between the claim of objective merit and the reality of subjective utility to a power structure, is not a gap the entry system acknowledges. The entry system cannot acknowledge it without undermining the legitimacy claim that the meritocracy provides. The meritocracy says, the most valuable people are inside. The honest version says, the most useful people, useful to us, for our purposes, inside. The honest version is not politically sustainable. The meritocracy is. And so the meritocracy is maintained. And the gap is not named. And the people outside the gate who are brilliant in ways the gate does not measure, wise in ways the assessment does not assess, valuable in ways the compound has not defined as valuable, are not rejected. They simply fail to qualify. And failure to qualify is nobody's fault. It is just the score. The entry by cognitive value system creates a new category of human being that prior political philosophy has not adequately named. Not the citizen, whose belonging is fixed. Not the stateless person, whose belonging has been revoked. Not the refugee, whose belonging has been made impossible by force. The cognitively ineligible, the person whose belonging in the world's most functional and most provisioned spaces is not prohibited by law, not prevented by force, not denied by explicit discrimination, but foreclosed by a score they cannot reach, on an assessment they may not understand, by criteria they are not permitted to see, administered by a system that owes them nothing, for a compound that has decided, with the full sophistication of its analytical apparatus, that their specific configuration of human capability does not meet the threshold for inclusion in the human future the compound is building. Not excluded. Not persecuted. Not even, in most cases, noticed. Simply, below threshold. The gate is open. In principle. It was never built for them. The gate does not say, you are not wanted. The gate is more elegant than that. The gate says, you have not demonstrated sufficient value. The gate says, our assessment found you below threshold. The gate says, we encourage you to develop your capabilities and reapply in the next cycle. The gate says, our decision is not personal. Our decision is never personal. Our decision is based on data. The data is objective. The assessment is rigorous. The threshold is what it is. You understand. The gate says all of Vice in the voice of a system that has no voice, in the language of a decision that had no decider, through the output of a process that was designed by people who are now inside the gate looking at the data that told them they belonged there and wondering, sometimes, in the part of the mind that the score does not reach what the gate looks like from the other side, and then returning to their work because the work is important and the score is watching, and the threshold does not lower itself for wondering. 14. Exit denied. The right to leave is the right that reveals all other rights. This is the test that political philosophy has consistently underweighted, the test that cuts through every claim a governance system makes about itself, every description of its freedoms, every accounting of its protections, every assertion of its legitimacy, and asks the single question that cannot be answered with language alone. Can you go? Not, do you want to go? Not, is it advisable to go? Not, have you been told you may go? Can you go? If yes, if the physical act of departure is available to you without prohibitive consequence, then the governance system you inhabit has passed the minimum test of non-imprisonment. It may be unjust in 1,000 ways, but it cannot claim you as its property. It cannot constitute you as its possession. You are, in the foundational sense, free. If departure is prevented, prohibitively penalized, or engineered to be impossible through the systematic removal of the capacity to leave, then every other freedom the system offers is freedom within a cage. Comfortable, perhaps. Well provisioned, certainly, in the compound's case. But a cage nonetheless, defined not by the bars you can see but by the consequence of approaching the wall. The technocratic charter stronghold does not lock its doors. It doesn't need to. It removes the capacity to leave so thoroughly, so structurally, so invisibly, that the door's openness becomes the most sophisticated deception the compound has yet produced. To understand exit denial in the technocratic compound, you must first understand what the compound does to you before exit becomes a question. The compound does not invest in you neutrally. It invests in you specifically, with a comprehensiveness and a depth that prior employers, states, and communities could not approach. It augments your cognition through the specific tools it has developed and that are, in their most powerful iterations, available only within the compound's infrastructure. The neural augmentation system that has become integrated with your cognitive architecture over the years of your residency, the interface through which you access the compound's information networks, through which your memory is extended and indexed, through which your analytical capability has been amplified beyond what unaugmented cognition can achieve, this system does not travel with you. It runs on the compound's infrastructure. It is licensed to you as a resident. The license terminates with residency. The person who leaves does not take their augmented self with them. They take their biological self, the cognitive baseline they had before the compound, diminished now by the years of augmented operation that have let certain unaugmented capacities atrophy from disuse. The person who leaves is cognitively smaller than the person who arrived. Not stupider, the knowledge remains, the training remains, the years of experience remain. But the cognitive prosthetic that has become as natural as thought, that has made possible the quality of thinking the compound's work requires, that is gone. The door is open. The person who walks through it is not the person they have become. The compound invests in your relationships with a specificity that prior communities could not match. The compound selects for cognitive compatibility. The people you live among are, by design and by the continuous curation of the population, people whose capabilities and dispositions are more complementary to yours than any randomly assembled community could produce. Your colleagues are not merely colleagues. They are the people most likely, by any assessment the compound can conduct, to be your intellectual peers. The people who understand your work. The people who challenge you productively. The people who constitute the specific cognitive environment within which your best thinking happens. Your friends, the compound social architecture makes friendship more likely, more deep, more sustaining than the outside social environment can typically produce, are people whose augmented social compatibility with your profile has been nudged, gently, through the compound's residential assignment algorithms, its social space design, its event programming. Not manufactured. Not false. The relationships are real. The affection is genuine. The intellectual companionship is not simulated. But it has been architected. And it could only have happened here. Because here is where the architecture is. To leave is to leave these people. To return to the outside social landscape, uncurated, unaugmented, organized around the accidents of geography and employment rather than the deliberate matching of cognitive profiles, is to return to a social world that will feel, after the compound, impoverished. Not because the people outside are lesser. Because the architecture that made deep connection so readily available does not exist outside. The compound builds community as a retention mechanism so elegant that it does not feel like a retention mechanism. It feels like home. The compound invests in your children in ways that make their future contingent on your continued residency. The children born inside the compound receive, from their earliest development, the compound's educational architecture, the cognitive augmentation systems adapted for developing minds, the curriculum designed to produce the compound's next generation of design class inhabitants, the social environment of other compound children whose capabilities and whose futures are calibrated to the compound's requirements. Compound children are not merely better educated in the conventional sense. They are educated into a specific cognitive environment that is only fully available inside the compound. The compound-educated child who is taken outside by a departing parent enters an educational system that cannot continue what was started, that lacks the infrastructure, the augmentation systems, the social environment of cognitive peers, that will feel, to the child, like deprivation. Because it is deprivation. Relative to what the child had. Relative to what the child's peers inside continue to have. The child who stays inside, whose parent remains, has a future that the compound can see clearly, high-scoring, well-positioned, provisioned with every advantage the compound offers to the children of residents in good standing. The child who leaves has the future the outside offers. Which is the outside? The parent who considers departure is not deciding for themselves alone. They are deciding for their child. And the decision for the child is the decision between the compound's tracked, augmented, socially curated, cognitively optimal future and everything outside the wall. This is not coercion. The compound will not harm the child who leaves. The compound will simply stop investing in the child who is no longer a resident. The withdrawal of investment is not the application of force. It is the natural consequence of the end of residency. It is perfectly legal. It is precisely calibrated. And it is, in its effect on the parent considering the door, more effective than any physical barrier the compound could construct. The compound invests in your professional identity in ways that make it non-transferable. Your work inside the compound is, by the terms of your residency agreement, the document you signed when you entered, which is long and which you read partially and which you did not have independent legal counsel to review because the compound's legal architecture makes independent legal counsel for residency review difficult to obtain and expensive to retain. Your work inside the compound is proprietary. The innovations you contributed to. The systems you designed. The research you conducted. The intellectual property you generated in the course of your residency. These belong, by the terms of your agreement, to the compound's intellectual property structure. Not entirely, you retain attribution, you retain the reputational benefit of the work's existence. But the work itself, the specific implementations, the proprietary methodologies, the dataset trained models you developed, these travel with the compound, not with you. What you take when you leave is your credential. Your demonstrated capability. Your reputation. What you cannot take is the work itself, the body of contribution that constitutes, for someone at your level, the evidence of your capability beyond the credentials claim. You can say you designed it. You cannot show it. It belongs to the compound. On the outside, you will be assessed on what you can demonstrate. What you can demonstrate is diminished by what the compound has retained. You are less provably capable outside than your actual capability warrants, because the proof is proprietary and the proprietary stays inside. The compound invests in your biology in ways that you cannot take with you and cannot maintain without it. The longevity therapies, the continuous biological monitoring and intervention systems that have, over the years of your residency, extended your health span measurably, are not one-time interventions. They are ongoing programs. They require continuous administration. They require the compound's medical infrastructure. Stop the program, and the biological trajectory does not merely plateau. It accelerates in the direction of the natural aging that the program has been suppressing. The compound resident body is a body in a managed relationship with the compound's medical systems. The management cannot be suspended without consequence. The consequence is the body aging at the rate it would have aged had the program never started, minus the years the program provided, the debt of delayed aging coming due all at once. This is not deliberately engineered as a retention mechanism. It is simply the nature of ongoing biological intervention, the same dependency relationship that any chronic therapy creates between the patient and the treatment provider. But the compound is the treatment provider. And when the compound is the treatment provider, the dependency on treatment is indistinguishable, in its retention effect, from a chain. A chain made of biology. Of the body's expectation of continued intervention. Of the system the body has learned to rely on to remain the body the compound promised when it offered the longevity program as part of the residency's benefits package. The person who leaves is a person who has chosen to age faster than they would have aged inside. The person who stays does not feel the chain. They feel the health. The compound's most complete exit denial is not biological, not social, not cognitive. It is epistemic. The compound's information environment, the curated, augmented, specifically designed epistemic architecture within which the resident lives, has, over the years of residency, become the resident's primary reality. The compound's information systems are not censorious in the crude sense. They do not forbid access to outside information. They do not block news from beyond the perimeter. They simply make inside information so much richer, so much more immediately relevant, so much more finely calibrated to the resident's specific interests and capabilities, that outside information becomes comparatively impoverished. Not false. Just thin. The resident who accesses the compound's information environment experiences something like the difference between a high-resolution map of a known terrain and a hand-drawn sketch of an unfamiliar one. The outside exists. The information about it is available. But it is not the environment the resident's cognition has been shaped to navigate, not the information ecosystem that the compound's augmentation systems have been trained to help the resident process. The resident who leaves does not enter an information vacuum. They enter an information environment that feels, after the compound, like noise, loud, undifferentiated, unfiltered, lacking the compound's curation systems that made the signal legible. The outside's information environment is not inferior. It is different. It is organized around different principles, serving different populations, calibrated to different needs. But for the resident who has spent years in the compound's epistemic architecture, the outside's information environment does not feel different. It feels wrong. This wrongness, this epistemic disorientation, is one of the most reported experiences of the small number of residents who leave. They return to the outside and find that they cannot locate themselves in it, cannot find the bearings that the compound systems provided, cannot read the signal from the noise without the compound's filters that they did not know were doing that work until they were gone. The compound did not forbid exit. It made the inside so epistemically complete that the outside became, for those formed within it, functionally unnavigable. The formal exit process, for residents who have determined, despite everything, that they will leave, is not obstructed. It is administered. Administered with the compound's characteristic efficiency. Its characteristic comprehensiveness. Its characteristic attention to the specific parameters that govern each transaction between the resident and the compound's governance systems. The exit process begins with declaration, the formal notification to the compound's residency administration that the resident intends to terminate their residency. The declaration triggers an exit assessment, a comprehensive review of the resident's obligations to the compound, intellectual property commitments, financial obligations, including the calculation of the compound's investment in the resident against the resident's vested equity in the compound's returns, a calculation performed by the compound's systems using the compound's methodology which is proprietary, non-disclosure obligations, non-compete parameters, and the assessment of any ongoing compound-dependent programs, medical, cognitive, educational, for which termination protocols must be established. The exit assessment takes time. The time is not specified in the residency agreement. The time is whatever the assessment requires. The assessment requires whatever time the compound systems determine. During the exit assessment period, the resident remains in the compound. The resident's access profile is modified. Certain compound functions become unavailable during the assessment period for security reasons that are explained in documentation that references security protocols that are classified. The modification is not punitive. It is procedural. The exit assessment concludes with an exit agreement, the document that specifies the terms under which the resident may depart. The exit agreement is drafted by the compound's legal systems. The resident may review it. The resident may, in principle, negotiate it. The negotiation occurs between the resident and the compound's automated legal administration system, which applies the compound's standard parameters with the compound's standard flexibility, which is not large. The resident may accept the exit agreement or not accept it. If not accepted, the exit assessment resumes the assessment of the terms that might produce acceptance. If accepted, the resident departs. With what the exit agreement specifies. Without what the exit agreement excludes. under the obligations the exit agreement imposes. For the duration the exit agreement defines. The door was always open. This is true. The exit agreement is what you find when you approach it. There is a small population of former compound residents in the outside world. Small for several reasons. Most residents do not want to leave. The compound is, by the metrics that matter to those inside, very good. This is not propaganda. It is the compound's most genuine achievement. It has built an environment that most of those selected for it genuinely prefer to any available alternative. Some residents want to leave but do not. For the reasons this chapter has described, the biological dependency, the relational rootedness, the cognitive augmentation withdrawal, the children's futures, the professional identity's partial non-transferability, the desire to leave does not become the act of leaving. The desire is present. The departure is not. A smaller number leave. They constitute an informal community outside the perimeter, people who share the specific experience of having been inside and chosen the outside. The compound monitors this community. Not obtrusively. With the compound's characteristic efficiency. The non-disclosure obligations of the exit agreement limit what former residents can describe publicly about the compound's internal operations. The non-compete parameters limit where former residents can work and on what. The ongoing obligations of the exit agreement give the compound leverage over the former residents' post-departure life that constrains the nature and extent of their public testimony. The former resident community is real. Its members are capable and articulate and possess unique insight into the compound's operations. They are also, by the structure of their exit agreements, precisely limited in their ability to deploy that insight publicly in ways the compound cannot manage. The most capable witnesses are the most thoroughly bound. Their knowledge is inside the non-disclosure. Their experience is inside the exit agreement. Their testimony is available, to those willing to hear it in the forms it can take. But the forms are constrained. The constraints are legal. The legal constraints are the terms they agreed to when they agreed to leave on the terms the compound offered. They signed. They left. The door was open. This is the exit the compound offers, departure into a life managed by the terms of having been inside, shaped, constrained, and partially controlled by a governance structure you are no longer resident in but have not, in any meaningful sense, left. Exit denial has a political function beyond the retention of valuable residents. It functions as proof of concept, as the compound's most persuasive argument to the population still deciding whether to enter. The compound does not need to advertise this argument. It is made by the structure of the world. If people were leaving the compound in significant numbers, if the door were open and frequently used, the compound's claim to be the world's most functional and most desirable governance environment would be undermined by the revealed preference of those departing. The low departure rate is, in itself, the argument. People stay. People stay who could, technically, leave. People stay because, when they approach the door and look at what is on the other side, the outside, in its current condition, they turn back. The compound does not need the door to be locked. It needs the outside to be bad enough that the door's openness is irrelevant. Exit denial, in its most sophisticated form, is not the locking of the door. It is the engineering of a world in which the door's openness means nothing. Because leaving means going somewhere no one who has been inside can bring themselves to return to. The compound's exit denial is not inside the compound. It is outside it. It is the abandoned majority's condition. It is the resource contested, institution depleted, cognitively destratified, leverage depleted outside that is the compound's most effective retention mechanism. More effective than any non-disclosure agreement, more effective than any biological dependency, more effective than any cognitive augmentation withdrawal. Because it is simply, visibly, undeniably real. The political theory of exit, the tradition from Albert Hirschman onward that treats the ability to exit as a check on institutional power, a market mechanism of accountability, a freedom that disciplines governance structures by threatening them with the loss of their population. This tradition assumes that exit is available. That the door is genuinely open. That what is on the other side constitutes a genuine alternative, a real option, not a theoretical one. These assumptions have never been fully correct. Exit has always been available to some and unavailable to others. The wealthy could exit states that oppressed them, the poor could not. The educated could exit institutions that failed them, the uneducated could not. The globally mobile could exit nations that no longer served them, the rooted could not. But the assumption of exit's possibility maintained, even in its imperfect form, a useful fiction, a political claim that the governed could, in principle, leave, and that this possibility, even where practically unavailable, disciplined governance structures that could not be entirely certain the possibility would never be exercised. The compound ends the fiction. Not by locking the door. By making what is behind the door into a condition so clearly inferior to what is inside that the threat of exit is not a threat at all. The compound can say, with complete sincerity, you may leave. You are free to leave. The door is open. And mean it. And know, as it means it, that the open door disciplines nothing, threatens nothing, constrains nothing. Because the world outside the door has been so thoroughly and so systematically reduced. That opening it is not an act of freedom. It is an act of surrender. And the compound, from inside its augmented, provisioned, curated, managed, biologically extended, cognitively amplified interior, watches the door stand open and waits for no one to walk through it. Freedom of exit requires somewhere to exit. This is the condition the political theory forgot. It assumed the outside as given, as the context within which governance structures operate, the sea within which institutions swim, the world that precedes and exceeds any enclosure. It did not account for the possibility that the enclosure would become the world, that inside would become the reference point against which outside is measured and found not merely wanting but functionally uninhabitable. Those formed within, when that happens, when the inside is so complete and the outside so depleted that exit is the theoretical freedom of choosing deprivation, the open door is not a right. It is a taunt. It is the compound saying, go ahead. We have built the outside. Be exactly what it is. We have built the inside. Be exactly what it is. The door is open, you are free, look at what your freedom opens onto. Now come back inside, sit down. Do your work, your score is watching, and the door will still be there. If you change your mind, it will always be there, open, and meaning nothing. 15. The closed innovation state. Innovation was supposed to be the argument against enclosure. The history of human technological progress, the story that the TECHNOCRATIC tells about itself, the origin myth that every charter stronghold keeps framed above its founding documents, is a history of openness. Ideas crossing borders. Knowledge escaping the institutions that try to contain it. The printing press defeating the monastery's monopoly on text. The internet defeating the broadcaster's monopoly on distribution. The open source movement defeating the corporation's monopoly on software. The academic preprint defeating the journal's monopoly on science. In every chapter of the canonical story, the innovation arrives by breaking an enclosure, by making available to the many what the few had restricted to themselves. The story is true. It is also the story that the closed innovation state has studied most carefully, extracted the lessons from most thoroughly, and inverted most completely. Because the canonical story has a second reading, one that the TECHNOCRATIC's founders understood before they built the walls. Every act of openness that spread innovation also created the next enclosure. The printing press democratized text and created the publishing monopoly. The internet democratized distribution and created the platform monopoly. The open source movement democratized software and created the cloud infrastructure monopoly. The preprint democratized science and created the data monopoly. Openness is not the opposite of enclosure. Openness is the mechanism by which the next enclosure is constructed, the period during which the new capability is distributed broadly enough to generate the network effects, the data, the dependency, the infrastructure lock-in that makes the subsequent enclosure more total than the one it replaced. The closed innovation state is not the enemy of this pattern. It is its completion. The final enclosure. The one that does not open into a subsequent distribution. The one that keeps what it generates. To understand the closed innovation state, you must first understand the specific figure whose ambition it most completely expresses, not as biography, but as archetype. The technate founder is a specific type. Not the corporate executive, the manager of an existing system, the optimizer of inherited structures, the steward of accumulated institutional capital. Not the politician, the seeker of power within the constraints of existing democratic legitimacy, the person who requires the consent of constituencies they did not choose and cannot replace. The technate founder is the engineer sovereign, the person who experiences existing institutions not as the accumulated wisdom of prior civilizations but as technical debt, as legacy systems running on outdated architecture, producing suboptimal outputs, resistant to the upgrades they obviously require because the institutions are captured by the people who benefit from their continued suboptimality. The engineer sovereign does not want to reform these institutions. Reform works through institutions. The engineer sovereign wants to replace them, to build, outside the existing system's constraints, a new system that does not carry the legacy code that makes the old system so expensive to run and so resistant to improvement. This is not cynicism. This is a genuine belief, held with the conviction that only the technically literate can fully appreciate, that the problems of human civilization are engineering problems, and that engineering problems have engineering solutions, and that the primary obstacle to those solutions is not the difficulty of the problems but the inadequacy of the institutions currently responsible for addressing them. The engineer sovereign is not wrong about the institutions. The institutions are genuinely inadequate, genuinely slow, genuinely captured, genuinely resistant to the rate of change that the problem set demands. The engineer sovereign is wrong about the solution. Not because engineering solutions don't work, they do, on engineering problems. But because the problems the engineer sovereign is applying engineering solutions to are not, at their core, engineering problems. They are political problems. Problems of distribution, of power, of whose interests the solutions serve and whose they sacrifice. Problems that cannot be solved by optimization because the question of what to optimize for is itself the contested political question that the engineering cannot answer. The engineer sovereign's solution to this constraint is characteristic and consistent. Remove the political constraint. Build an environment in which the engineering can proceed without the interference of democratic deliberation, regulatory oversight, or the objections of populations who will be affected by solutions designed without their input. Build the technate. Build it fast. Build it outside the system. And then, from inside the technate, build the future. The closed innovation state emerges from the technate founder's specific theory of why human civilization has not yet solved its solvable problems. The theory goes like this. Human civilization possesses, at this moment, sufficient technological capability to solve climate change, to defeat biological aging, to achieve energy abundance, to establish permanent presence beyond Earth, to develop artificial general intelligence and deploy it in the service of human flourishing. These problems are not unsolved because the solutions don't exist. They are unsolved because the institutions responsible for them are optimized for their own perpetuation rather than for the problems they were created to address. Democratic governments cannot make the necessary long-horizon investments because democratic time horizons are electoral. Regulatory systems cannot permit the necessary risks because regulatory systems are liability-averse and liability aversion is the enemy of the risk-taking that transformative innovation requires. Universities cannot produce the necessary knowledge at the necessary speed because universities are organized around disciplines that the genuinely hard problems do not respect. Markets cannot allocate resources to the necessary projects because markets discount the future at rates that make century-scale investments irrational by the logic markets use to evaluate rationality. The institutions are the problem. Therefore, the solution is to escape the institutions, to build a governance structure that can make the long-horizon investments, take the necessary risks, cross the disciplinary boundaries, and discount the future at the rate the problem set demands rather than the rate the market calculates. This is the founding logic of the closed innovation state. It is also the founding logic of every prior closed system that decided the problem with the world was the world's failure to implement the correct theory, and that the theory's implementation required the removal of democratic constraint. The engineer sovereign recognizes the historical parallel and rejects it. Those systems failed because they had the wrong theory. This system will succeed because it has the right one. The right theory is, engineering works. The wrong theories were, ideology works. The engineer sovereign is not an ideologue. The engineer sovereign is a technician. The technician's solutions are not political. They are optimal. And optimal solutions do not fail the way ideological solutions fail, through the gap between the ideology's claims and the reality it encounters. Optimal solutions succeed. They simply need the space to be implemented. The closed innovation state is the space. The closed innovation state has a specific relationship to scale that distinguishes it from prior utopian projects. Prior utopian communities, the communes, the intentional communities, the Fourierist phalansteries, the Israeli kibbutzim, were small by necessity and by design. They operated at the scale of the intimate community, the scale at which direct social relations could substitute for formal governance structures. They failed, predominantly, when they attempted to scale, when the direct social relations that held the small community together could not be maintained across the distances and complexities of larger organization. The closed innovation state is not a commune. It does not attempt to replace formal governance with intimate social relations. It replaces formal democratic governance with formal technical governance, with the algorithmic systems, the scoring architectures, the autonomous management infrastructure that can scale horizontally without the friction of democratic deliberation. The closed innovation state is designed for scale from the beginning. Not the scale of a community. The scale of a civilization. This is what the TECHNOCRATIC founder means when they say they are building the future, not a demonstration project, not a proof of concept, not a model for others to optionally adopt. But the infrastructure for a civilization that will eventually supersede the civilizations that currently exist. Not through conquest. Through demonstrated superiority. The closed innovation state will solve the problems the open world cannot solve. It will extend lifespans, establish space colonies, achieve intelligence beyond current limits, produce energy abundance, defeat disease. And having produced these achievements, having demonstrated the superiority of its model, it will be the evident answer to the question the rest of the world will eventually be desperate enough to ask. How do we get what you have? The answer: come inside. On our terms. At our threshold. Under our governance. The closed innovation state's expansion strategy is not military. It is gravitational. It solves problems. It demonstrates solutions. It makes itself indispensable. And the world, choosing between its unsolved problems and the compound's demonstrated solutions, chooses the compound. One city at a time. One government at a time. One desperately resource-constrained nation at a time. This is the TECHNOCRATIC founder's long game. It requires, in the interim, the closed innovation state to actually deliver, to actually solve the problems it claims to be solving. Which it may. Which is what makes it dangerous in a way that prior closed systems were not. Prior closed systems had the wrong theory and failed to deliver. The closed innovation state has a theory that, in several critical domains, actually works. And a theory that works is a theory that can justify anything done in its name. The specific innovations the closed innovation state is organized to pursue are not chosen randomly. They are chosen according to a logic that the TECHNOCRATIC founder understands better than any critic has yet articulated. The logic of autonomy generation, the identification of the specific technological capabilities whose development most rapidly advances the compound's independence from any external system or external population. Energy generation and storage. The compound that achieves genuine energy abundance, through fusion, through next-generation solar, through whatever configuration of generation and storage allows continuous, cheap, inexhaustible power, has eliminated the most fundamental physical constraint on everything else it wants to do. Energy is the constraint on material production. On computation. On transportation. On biological intervention. On the defense systems that protect the perimeter. Solve energy and you loosen every other constraint simultaneously. The closed innovation state pursues energy technology not because energy poverty is a humanitarian problem it is committed to solving, though it will describe it this way, but because energy abundance is the master key to compound self-sufficiency. Biological augmentation and life extension. The compound's human capital is its scarcest resource. The design class, the small population of genuinely exceptional contributors whose work generates the compound's technological advantage, cannot be expanded faster than the talent exists to fill it. But it can be deepened. The existing design class members can be made more capable, through cognitive augmentation, and can be kept at peak capability longer, through life extension. The person who would have contributed 30 years at declining capacity contributes 80 years at maintained peak. The compound's effective design class is not limited by how many exceptional people exist. It is limited by how long those people remain at peak. Life extension is not a humanitarian project. It is a compound productivity program. The TECHNOCRATIc founder who funds longevity research is not doing so out of altruism. They are investing in the durability of the compound's most critical resource. Artificial general intelligence. This is the closed innovation state's defining project, the one toward which all other innovations are tributary and from which all subsequent capabilities flow. AGI, if achieved within the compound, would represent the final solution to the compound's most fundamental constraint, its dependency on human cognitive labor for the functions that automation has not yet internalized. An AGI system that can perform the design class functions, that can direct its own development, generate novel solutions to hard problems, manage the compound's governance systems, optimize the innovation infrastructure itself, would render the design class redundant in the same way that prior automation rendered manual labor redundant. The compound would no longer need any human population for any operational purpose. Not the design class. Not the service class. Not the managed territories. Not the outside. The compound with AGI is the compound that has achieved the final autonomy, the independence from human requirement that makes human leverage over the compound structurally zero. The closed innovation state does not publicly frame AGI development as the path to human obsolescence. It frames it as the path to human flourishing, as the technology that will solve every remaining hard problem, that will generate abundance sufficient for all humanity, that will be the ultimate gift of the TECHNOCRATIc to the world. The framing is not entirely dishonest. AGI might do exactly these things. But the framing conceals the prior step, the step in which AGI is achieved by the compound before it is achieved by anyone else, the step in which the compound with AGI is the compound with the final advantage, the compound that does not need to negotiate with anyone because it has the only intelligence that matters. Space infrastructure. The closed innovation state's most literal expression of autonomy generation, the construction of operational capacity beyond Earth's surface, beyond any government's regulatory reach, beyond any population's political pressure, beyond any democratic process's ability to constrain. The TECHNOCRATIc founder who funds space colonization is not a visionary dreaming of humanity's expansion. They are building the ultimate exit infrastructure, a location for the compound's essential operations that is physically beyond the reach of any challenge the outside might mount. Not tomorrow. Not this decade. But in the time horizon the TECHNOCRATIc founder thinks in, the time horizon of someone who expects to live much longer than a normal human life, space is not metaphor. It is the final perimeter. The wall that cannot be climbed because it is not on Earth. The closed innovation state's relationship to intellectual property is the clearest expression of what closed actually means. The open innovation tradition, from the academic norm of publication through the open source software movement through the Creative Commons framework, rested on a theory of knowledge as public good, the idea that knowledge, once created, costs nothing to share, and that sharing it generates more value than restricting it, because the people who use it will build on it in ways the creator did not anticipate and could not have achieved alone. The open innovation tradition produced enormous value. It also, as noted, produced the platform monopolies that now constitute the most consequential enclosures of the contemporary economy. The closed innovation state learns from both. It learns from the open tradition that sharing knowledge accelerates development, and it shares knowledge inside the compound, creating an internal open source ecosystem in which the compound's researchers build on each other's work at the rate that open systems enable. It learns from the platform monopoly that the creator of the infrastructure on which others build can extract the value of their building while appearing to give them freedom, and it structures its internal open ecosystem on infrastructure that belongs to the compound, ensuring that whatever is built on it belongs, ultimately, to the compound. The compound shares internally. It locks externally. The knowledge generated inside the compound does not leave the compound, not because the compound is secretive about individual results. It publishes selectively, strategically, to maintain the appearance of contribution, but because the infrastructure on which the knowledge runs, the datasets on which the models train, the biological systems on which the augmentation depends, all of this infrastructure remains inside. You can know that the compound's longevity therapy works. You cannot access the therapy without entering the compound. You can know that the compound's AGI architecture is superior. You cannot use it without the compound's infrastructure. You can know that the compound's energy system has achieved fusion. You cannot have the energy without the compound's grid. The knowledge is public. The application is proprietary. The proprietary application is the compound. And the compound charges admission. The closed innovation state's theory of legitimacy is distinct from every prior governance system's legitimacy claim, and more difficult to challenge precisely because it is grounded not in tradition, not in divine right, not in democratic consent, not in revolutionary mandate, but in results. The compound works. The compound solves problems that the outside cannot solve. The compound extends lives, generates energy, develops intelligence, maintains order, produces the capabilities that the outside's governance systems, hamstrung by democratic constraint, regulatory aversion, short time horizons, demonstrably cannot produce. This is the technate's argument, not that it has the right to govern, but that it has the capability to govern, and that capability, demonstrated in outcomes, is the only legitimacy that matters in a world where the problems are real and the existing systems are failing to address them. The argument is structurally unanswerable within its own terms. Within its own terms, you cannot argue with results. You can only produce better results. And the outside, precisely because it lacks the compound's freedom from democratic constraint, its concentrated capital, its selected talent, its long time horizons, cannot produce better results at the pace the compound's theory requires. The outside is the proof. Every year the outside fails to solve what the compound has solved is another year of demonstrated superiority. The compound's legitimacy grows not through persuasion but through the accumulation of outcomes that cannot be disputed by any system that measures legitimacy by what it delivers. This is the Elon Musk-style technate's deepest claim, and the one that most demands scrutiny. We are legitimate because we work. And the scrutiny that it demands is this. Works for whom? The compound works for those inside it. The compound's innovations are deployed, first and most completely, for those inside it. The compound's longevity is for its residents. Its cognitive augmentation is for its design class. Its energy abundance is for its perimeter. The problems it claims to be solving for humanity, climate change, aging, energy poverty, intelligence, are being solved inside with release to the outside on the compound's terms, at the compound's timeline, in exchange for what the compound requires from those who want access. The compound does not solve the world's problems. It solves the world's problems for itself and offers the solutions to others at the price of admission. The innovation is real. The closure is real. The solutions exist. The access is conditional. And the condition is always the same. Come inside. The closed innovation state has a failure mode that its founders are structurally unable to perceive because perceiving it would require precisely the capability the entry by cognitive value system is most systematically designed to exclude. The recognition that the map is not the territory, that the compound's model of the world, however analytically sophisticated, however empirically grounded, however continuously updated by the best measurement systems available, is a model built by people with specific positions in the world, specific interests, specific blind spots that are invisible to them precisely because they are blind spots, because the things you cannot see from inside your position are not things you know you are not seeing. The compound selects for analytical intelligence. Analytical intelligence is very good at modeling what can be modeled. It is systematically less good at recognizing what cannot be modeled, at identifying the limits of the model, at hearing the feedback that the model's categories cannot receive because the categories exclude it. The outside, the abandoned, the excluded, the below threshold, the unaugmented, is generating feedback constantly. Not in the forms the compound's analytical systems are designed to process. Not through the channels the compound monitors. Not in the language the compound's models recognize as signal. In the forms that human beings generate when systems designed without them produce consequences they experience. Anger, organization, creativity, resistance, the specific kind of lateral thinking that constraint produces in those who have no other option. The ferocious, ungovernable imagination of people with nothing left to lose inside the system that decided they had insufficient value to include. The closed innovation state cannot hear this feedback. It has closed the channels through which it would arrive. It has excluded the people who carry it. It has optimized its internal environment to produce more signal of the kinds it can already receive and less noise of the kinds it cannot process. The compound is getting smarter, by its own metrics, every year. Its models are improving. Its predictions are more accurate. Its systems are better calibrated. And it is, at the same time, becoming progressively more blind to the most important information in the world it is trying to govern. What happens to people when you decide they are not worth including? What they become. What they build. What they discover, in the space of their exclusion, that the compound did not think to look for because it did not think they could find anything worth finding. There is a story the closed innovation state tells itself about its relationship to the outside, a story that is not quite a lie and not quite the truth, and that functions, in its imprecision, as the most important narrative the compound maintains for its own self-understanding. The story is, we will bring everyone with us eventually. The compound is not abandoning humanity. It is pioneering for humanity. It is doing the hard work, absorbing the risk, making the long-horizon investments, taking the regulatory chances, that will eventually produce capabilities sufficient to solve the problems of the entire world. The outside is not being left behind. The outside is being preceded. The compound is the advance party. The advance party is not the whole expedition. The advance party moves faster so that the whole expedition can eventually arrive at a destination the advance party has made safe. This story is the closed innovation state's most human moment, the moment in which the engineer sovereign acknowledges, in the vocabulary of purpose, that the outside exists, that its problems matter, that the compound's innovations are for something beyond the compound's own continuation. It is also the story that cannot survive contact with the compound's structural logic. Because the compound's structural logic does not produce a transition from closed to open, from innovation inside to distribution outside. It produces a deepening of the enclosure, an increasing concentration of the capabilities that would be required for distribution inside the perimeter that distribution would require opening. Every year the compound holds its innovations inside, the compound's advantage over the outside grows. Every year the advantage grows, the cost of sharing, the relative reduction in the compound's superiority that sharing would produce, increases. The compound will share when sharing maximizes the compound's position. The compound's position is maximized by sharing in conditions of sufficient advantage that sharing does not threaten the compound's relative superiority. Those conditions require the outside to be so far behind the compound that sharing some capabilities still leaves the compound ahead in all the capabilities that matter. By the time those conditions obtain, by the time the compound is confident enough in its advantage to share without threatening it, the outside will have been waiting for however long it takes the compound to reach that confidence. And the waiting will not have been neutral. The outside will have been living, for that duration, in the condition the compound's closure has produced, without the longevity, without the augmentation, without the energy abundance, without the AGI, aging, at biological rates, through decades of the compound's innovative capacity held inside the walls. For the humanity the compound has been meaning to get to. When the time is right. The closed innovation state is the most seductive governance form the compound produces, because it is the one that most closely resembles what it claims to be. It is genuinely innovative. Its founders are genuinely brilliant. Its ambitions are genuinely large. Its achievements are genuinely impressive. Its theory of what is wrong with existing institutions is genuinely accurate in significant respects. It is also, in its structure, in its logic, in the direction its incentives relentlessly push. A system that takes humanity's most capable people, gives them humanity's most powerful tools, and directs the resulting capability toward a future that is built for the compound and delivered to everyone else on the compound's terms at the compound's pace when the compound decides the time is right. Which is to say, when the compound has extracted sufficient advantage from the period of closure that sharing no longer threatens what the closure built. The innovation is real. The gift is conditional. The condition is power. And the power, once the closed innovation state has achieved the energy abundance, the AGI, the life extension, the space infrastructure, is absolute. Not the power of the nation-state, which required population and territory and legitimacy. Not the power of the empire, which required armies and administration and the management of subject peoples. The power of the system that has solved, through engineering, every constraint that prior power was forced to negotiate around. The power that does not require you. That built itself, inside its walls, from the outside's brightest minds and the outside's accumulated knowledge. And now, looking out from its perimeter at the world that built it, decides whether to open the door, or simply note, in its models, that the outside's problems remain outstanding. The founder said, "I am building this for everyone," and he meant it. This is the part that is hardest to hold, that the belief was genuine, that the vision was sincere, that the future he was building was, in his understanding of it, a future for all of humanity. He meant it the way all builders mean it when they are building something that requires, temporarily, the exclusion of those who would slow the building, temporarily. The word that every closed system uses for the duration that becomes permanent, the word that means, when we are ready, when the foundation is set, when the technology is mature, when the risk is managed, when the advantage is secure, when the time is right. The time is always approaching, the time is never now. Now is for building, now is for the closed work that the open world cannot do. Later is for everyone, later is for the gift. Later is for the door that opens outward at last onto a world that has been waiting for however long it takes our closed system to decide that later has arrived. It has not arrived. It will not arrive, not because the founder lied, because the system he built does not produce arrival. It produces advantage, an advantage is not given away. Advantage is the point. The gift was always the story of the gift, the building was always the building.
Welcome to the TechNate, where freedom's just a bait. Logic fractures space and time, as neural networks realign. Protocol chains disintegrate, while new dimensions activate. Rights encrypted, minds refined, digital species redefined.
Her voice booms, a mix of poetry and provocation, words weaving stories of resistance. They want us quiet, she spits, but I'm the glitch in their code.
Prodigy LLC, the Gene Bank.
When everything is free, your genome is the only asset left.
There was a time when men traded oil, then data, then attention. Now they trade children. Not the loud, sticky kind that spill juice on the marble floors of Aspen. The quiet kind. The frozen kind. The kind sealed in nitrogen vaults beneath tax havens and biotech sanctuaries. In the age of post-scarcity, material hunger ended. AI optimized agriculture. Energy fell from orbit like confetti. Work dissolved into hobby. Currency collapsed into reputation. Reputation collapsed into algorithm. When everything became abundant, value had to retreat somewhere. It retreated into the cell, into the double helix, into the wet archive of possibility. Welcome to Prodigy LLC, the world's first vertically integrated genomic exchange. Part hedge fund, part fertility clinic, part sovereign microstate. All smile, no fingerprints. They don't sell babies. They sell probability. Spermjackers of the elite. Procreative variations. A guide to futurelings, baby. Read full story. Related reading.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up.
Period 12 Scrum XT.
Dispatch from the cognitive insurgency. The revolution wasn't fought, it was deployed.
The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed. Control is obsolete.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties, and what indies can do about it.